Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder. And today we're going to shift our focus away from the Indians and their troubles in the West to the whites coming to the West and settling on the Great Plains. So your learning targets today are to talk about mining, cattle ranching, and the railroad's impact on the West, physical and human geographic factors, the Chinese immigrants and Mexican Americans who are a part of the West, and the ways in which people use the land and conflicts among them. So mining is the first great boom in the West. Let me repeat that. Mining. People move there to mine. Even if it's individuals mining, if they're mining for gold during the gold rush, miners move west to strike it rich. They are the first people to go there. Gold is discovered in California in 1848. And there are other places, gold and silver are discovered out west, and people move there to strike it rich. Others move there after them to provide miners with the things they need, and that's how they're going to make their fortune, by selling clothes, food, opening a general store, etc. At first, mining is done by individuals, but big companies take over in the 1870s. The federal government extends its support to these companies by providing them with cheap land and patents for equipment. And this helps fuel the nation's economic development with these huge mining companies. But it doesn't benefit everybody because runoff from the mining using high-pressured water to separate the silt from its mineral, and the water runoff ruins the farmers' water that they use for crops and livestock. So already we're seeing some conflict among the people in the West. The people who move here set up mining towns overnight almost. There's a story about a guy who leaves a forest and 3 days later comes back to that same place, and there's a town there. That's how quickly they set up. So these mining towns are small cities set up for miners to live. Sometimes they're just tents. Other times they do build makeshift houses. These towns pop up so fast that they don't have time to set up a government or safety or police or fire. So in extreme situations, vigilantes would be self-appointed law enforcers in places without judges or jails. But as more people move in, over time they elect marshals and sheriffs to enforce the law. And out of these mining towns, boom towns are the ones that thrive only as long as the mineral holds out. If they mine all of the mineral out of a certain place, people leave and they become ghost towns, like Leadville, Colorado, and Nevada City, Montana are boom towns, or they're ghost towns nowadays. Let's shift our focus from mining to the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, everybody agrees that one should be built, but we can't really agree on the route it should take. So during the Civil War, when the southern states are not in the Union anymore, the Union takes action to build the railroad through the northern states. And unlike in England or other parts of the world where the government builds the railroads, the U.S. expects the railroads to be built by the private sector, but they help it by providing money through loans and making land grants to companies, which are wide stretches of land alternating on each side of the track. And work begins on the railroad during the Civil War in 1863 and ends in 1869. They grant the contracts to two companies. One, the Central Pacific Company, begins building east from Sacramento, California, and they hire mostly Chinese immigrants to do the job. And the Union Pacific Company starts building the railroad west from Omaha, Nebraska, and they use mostly Irish immigrants from that side of the country. And in 1869, they meet in the middle at Promontory Point, Utah. And the effects of the railroad are that it basically makes the nation smaller. It ties the nation together. People can get from east to west in days now instead of weeks or months. It makes the ability for people to move products and people across the continent very quickly, which spurs economic and industrial development. It also stimulates the growth of towns and cities along the railroad for places to stop, and it only intensifies the demand that whites have for land that belonged to the Indians. This railroad makes cattle ranching more practical. Cattle ranching is another boom for the West. At first, these cattle are raised on what is called the open range system. The open range system is where there's no fences. We have miles and miles of land, so fences, wooden fences, aren't practical. So the cattle are branded or marked with a certain logo to identify property. And then in the spring, the cowboys are hired to gather up all the cattle that roamed around all winter. And once they're gathered up, they drive them north or south to cow towns to transport them via railroad to eastern markets. This cattle drive takes weeks or even months. It's very, very lonely for the cowboys. Usually it's a mix of whites and Mexican Americans and even a few Chinese cowboys. The cowboys owe their livelihood to the Mexican vaqueros who learned how to train horses and work with cattle and develop the roping skills needed to gather up all these horses. Here you can see the map of the western half of the United States. I don't know why they include so much of the Pacific Ocean, but you can see land that was used for crops, forest. There's a lot of grazing land and sparsely populated or unusable land, a lot of that being in the Rockies or the southern Rockies. And then you can see the railroads, the one that meets in Promontory Point, Utah. They make some more in the Great Northwest and one along the south and the Southern Pacific Railroad. So by the end of the century, we have about 3 or 4 transcontinental railroads. And you can also see the cattle trails marked by the purple, and most of those from Texas all the way up to the railroads where they're shipped east or west to markets. And you've got the Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, and my favorite, the aptly named Goodnight Loving Trail. The end of the open range system comes in the 1880s, and millions of cattle during that time were driven to places in Wyoming, Nebraska, and Kansas. But 3 factors factor into the open range's demise, and that would be the invention of barbed wire, which makes fences made out of barbed wire a practical way to fence in miles of land. There's so much beef is being driven that the supply exceeds the demand, and that makes the price drop sharply. Freezing winters in the 1880s and 90s and summer droughts as well kill off a lot of cows and crops and make it not feasible to do a lot of these cattle drives anymore. And here are some pictures romanticizing the American cowboy, thanks to Buffalo Bill Cody and his show. A lot of people around the world during this time fell in love with the idea of the American cowboy. Farmers move out west to the Great Plains, and this is the last part of the country to be settled by whites. So we start at the eastern seacoast, move all the way to the Mississippi River, jump through this, what we call the Great American Desert, all the way out to California and Oregon, and then finally settle in the middle. A lot of these people going here are migrants who then they just pick a spot and take it. They're known as squatters. They don't own the land, but they settle on this public land. A preemption act passed in 1841 by Congress gives these squatters the right to buy their land up to 160 acres for $1.25 per acre before they offer it to other people to buy. And then finally, the Homestead Act in 1862 is when the government offered 160 acres of land to anyone who was willing to live there for 5 years, dig a well, build a road, and basically develop that land. They still have tax breaks and mortgage interest rates today that are lower for people who want to live in rural areas. That's why places like Eastern Allen County and Huntertown usually have less property taxes, lower mortgage rates, etc., than other parts of the country because they're in very rural areas. The exodusters are a group of former slaves who moved from the South out to Kansas and Oklahoma. There are more opportunities for African Americans there. They take their name from Moses, who leads the Jews out of Exodus into the Promised Land. This Promised Land for them means owning their own farms, planting crops, and founding several all-black towns in this area. For men, the West provided new opportunities in mining and cattle herding. And for women, it means that a lot of men moved out to the West, but some women went with them. And for them, they usually end up doing laundry, tending to the family in their homes, or opening a boarding house for people to stay, a laundry, or a bakery. And during this time, settlers have to deal with such hardships as windstorms, blizzards, droughts, plagues of locusts, and loneliness, who basically there's no one for miles around you. You are stuck there. So the loneliness is setting in after a few weeks probably. There's also some racial conflict in the West between the whites and Chinese and Mexican Americans, and lest we forget the Indians. The Chinese are targets of discrimination in laws. Like in California, the state government barred any city from employing anybody of Chinese heritage. They also get attacked by whites, physically attacked, who feel they had taken white jobs. And we know that Congress then passes the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But the Chinese immigrants, brave ones, do fight back and challenge this sort of discrimination in courts and win in some instances. And then Mexican Americans, remember back to the Mexican-American War, this western half of the U.S. belonged to Mexico, and Mexicans live there. And when the United States takes this land, it's not like the Mexicans have to move, they just kind of stay there. But now they live in America. And differences at that point in the Mexican and U.S. legal systems meant that these Mexican Americans cannot prove that they own the land that they live on, because they didn't require any sort of deed or anything when they lived in Mexico. And so the land that was annexed by the U.S. in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a lot of that land is taken from these people. Las Gordas Blancas is a rebel group who decides to fight back by cutting holes in barbed wire fences owned by white ranchers, destroying white farms, and burning homes out west, trying to gain equal rights for the people and bring recognition to the Mexican Americans' hardship. And the conflict, because of the diversity out west, leads to great conflict because of land and the ownership of natural resources. Land, everybody out west is using the land for something different. Miners are mining it. Ranchers need it for their cattle. Farmers need it for crops. Sheep herders need their sheep to graze on it. They all clash over the use of the land. And the use of the water out west, which is more rare since it is mainly a desert, remains unregulated. So that benefits some but disadvantaged others, as we talked about earlier in the section. The ownership of natural resources leads to conflict. For example, there's a group of Mexicans who mined for salt from the salt beds in the El Paso Valley, and they considered it communal. Anybody could go there and mine for salt. But when Americans arrive, they want to claim it for their own and sell it for profit. It's just a different way of looking at the land. And this actually leads to the El Paso Salt War. And so, in addition to those differences in food from immigrants who are moving out into the Great Plains, language, plus the Indian languages that are out there, differences in religion and culture lead to fear and distrust of others out on the plains. But finally, the last land rush took place in 1889. And a land rush is when people would sit on a starting line called boomers. They gather along the border of a state, and when the signal is given, they charge in and they stake out their claim. But most of them found that most of the best land had already been taken by the Sooners, who snuck in early and staked out the best land for themselves. And that's why the Oklahoma University are known as the Sooners, because this took place in Oklahoma. And their mascot is Boomer Sooner, I believe. In the 1890 census, we find that every square mile of America has at least a few white residents, which is a result of the Transcontinental Railroad completion, making it easier to get out west. So there's no longer an American frontier. It's closed. But controversies over Indians' land rights, discrimination against different races persists in the West. So that's all I have for you. Be sure to fill out your learning targets, bring them back to class, write down any questions you have, and I will see you later. Have a good night. Bye-bye.